Welcome to the Social Change Diaries, the show that looks behind the curtain at everything you want to know about the social justice and nonprofit landscape. I'm your host, Vanessa Wakeman. Welcome to the Social Change Diaries. This is the first of our final 2 episodes of our season of philanthropy. Today, I'll be speaking with Tamir Novotny, Executive Director of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, also known as EPIP. Tamir took the helm as Executive Director in 2015, following a 3-year engagement with the organization. Starting as a chapter leader in New York, Tamir went on to join EPIP's national team, supporting chapters in the Northeast and advising the national leadership. Prior to his appointment, he held multiple positions over 9 years at Living Cities, a philanthropic collaborative focused on improving the lives of low-income urban residents. There, he developed and led portfolios in areas including housing, smart growth, and civic technology. Most recently, Tamir developed and launched the City Accelerator, a $3 million initiative to speed the spread of municipal innovation, and the Civic Tech and Data Collaborative, a partnership to harness the power of technology and data to address issues like criminal justice and youth employment. All right, so I would like to welcome Tamir to this episode of the Social Change Diaries, and really eager to chat with him about emerging practitioners and future leaders in philanthropy. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So, Tamir, on this season, we've had a number of conversations with people from different areas about philanthropy. So we've talked about, Latinos and philanthropy, African Americans. We spoke with Edgar Villanueva about decolonizing wealth. And so really interesting perspectives. And I thought it would be important to round out some of these conversations and some of these points that have come up and really diving into sort of the younger leaders in philanthropy. I'm a big believer that the future generations are going to sort of, disrupt and make some changes that will be really valuable in how we look at philanthropy and social change. And so I'm happy to have you here as the Executive Director of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy and get your perspective and just your insights about what you're seeing in the field and what your members are sharing around their needs or what's happening or what's, what they're feeling inspired about or what they're frustrated about. So I guess my first question is, what are some of the areas where you are seeing innovation in philanthropy as it relates to emerging leaders?
Awesome. Thank you for the question. And if you don't mind, I just want to provide a little bit of background on sort of where we've been and where we're going, because it puts all the rest in context. Is that all right?
Sure.
So first of all, in our view, the times we live in, they really demand that philanthropy step into deeper leadership for equity and social justice. And when you look at who's doing that in the country, a lot of it is young people of color, young queer women of color, who are really stepping up and setting the direction for progress in our nation. And in many cases, the people who make up our membership are essentially in the same cohort of folks, just in a different position in the field. EPIP, for its part, is sort of undergoing its own metamorphosis. And, for many years, there was this back and forth question where we were asking ourselves, is EPIP really a professional development and networking organization, or is it a social justice organization? And we made a decision about 2.5 years ago, around the time that I started, that our goal was really to advance social justice. And as we started to figure out what that was going to look like, what we realized was, one, we had one of the most diverse memberships in the field. And diversity is a big topic in philanthropy right now, as I'm sure your guests have alluded to. Our members, by our data, 45% people of color, 2/3 women, at least 10% LGBTQ, and many of them carry more than one of those identities. The second thing is, folks would come to us and say, we're here to expand our networks and gain skills. But when you started digging deeper with them into, where they're feeling stuck or what they want to focus on, people were feeling really isolated. And they were struggling basically with the same set of barriers in terms of culture within their institutions, right? So they were maybe stuck in roles that weren't allowing the full extent of what they bring to the table to come to the fore. They were advocating for communities and for grassroots leadership in cultures that prized, scale and other things that tend to lead foundations to larger, usually white-led organizations. And often their concerns were dismissed or they were associated with them personally as opposed to sort of larger generational, dare I say, shift that's happening in the country and across the world. And we decided that it wasn't enough just to create space for folks to sort of find, fellow travelers in that journey, but then go back into institutions facing those same conditions. So we revamped our whole organizational identity around this idea, rewrote our mission, vision, and values to center equity and social justice, revamped our programs to center people of color and others whose identities are not privileged in society or in the workplace, went from a skills-based approach to professional development to a leadership development approach really rooted in helping people transform philanthropy from within. And what we've heard from our sister organizations is that kind of change often starts in the middle or at the bottom of the organizational chart. And in addition to that, as you know from our background conversations, we've taken on an advocacy approach to this also, and we believe that there is, and this gets into your question, that foundations are really at a point where they recognize the need for change. I think that's a big part of the driving force behind this conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think somewhere in the back of their minds, they know that their emerging leaders have a ton to offer. We often talk about emerging folks as the future leadership of philanthropy. We have people who are leading now. The question is, are their institutions getting the most out of that leadership? And too often, the process and culture and systems within a foundation are set up in such a way that emerging leaders, let alone communities, right, which is ultimately where the learning really needs to come from, are only able to provide, insight or input after decisions have already been made. And that undercuts our commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion because, the folks who are the most diverse, sort of by level in the org chart or lower in the org chart, but it's also bad for organizational learning, and by extension, it's bad for organizational effectiveness. And that's the place where we're really zeroing in, and we've had a lot of interest from foundation leaders in what we've been learning. You've seen that there's a study we'll be releasing soon that starts to point to what emerging leaders are experiencing. Part of our reasoning for doing that is that we hear these stories all the time. I mean, all the time, at events, in the hall, meeting after the meeting, at the bar, but they never seem to quite get to the main stage when you're at a conference and you're sort of listening to the keynote or the plenary. And so we're trying to put that on the table in a way that takes the onus off of the individual to prove that there is an issue and to say instead, this is actually a generational issue. This is happening across the field. And the more we do this, the more patterns we see about that. So that's sort of the background. And, to your question about where are we seeing innovation or things that are being done differently, one thing, this isn't really an innovation necessarily, but it's a small paradigm shift that I think actually is truly transformative. Organizations that open to their staff in such a way that they can actually be transformed by what they hear. And this goes back to what I was saying before. So Susan Batten from ABFI, who says that racial equity processes within foundations often start in the middle. So I'll use the example of my former employer, Living Cities. It's a philanthropic collaborative. And after Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown were killed, there were staff internally who said, not only do I not feel like I can bring my full self to work, but I actually can't stay in this field if we can't actually talk about race. And even the CEO says at first that he was like, he didn't see it. And they persisted. And they went from from having no explicit racial equity analysis to just last week being a founding partner of a nationwide effort to sign organizations onto a racial equity agenda with the Governing Alliance for Race and Equity and I believe Race Forward and a couple of others. That was over a period of about 5 years. And one of the people who started that process internally, who was a senior associate at the time, now leads their equity work and is a senior member of the staff. So there are a few examples of things like that are happening. And then there are other places that, on the flip side, hire for diversity, and then they think they've achieved equity. And I'll tell you, I have a lot of conversations with folks. We're very fortunate. We have very diverse candidate pools for the positions we hire for, but a lot of that is because people are vouching for us right now. I have conversations with people where they say, we're trying to hire for this position, and the pools are really white, and you hear the gamut in terms of why people think that is. But a lot of it has to do with, what can people expect when they're on the other side of the hiring process? And people talk, right? And so they know what's going on in the culture of the organization. And the organizations that I believe are really making change, one, they're putting people actually in charge of that. A lot of places I talk to, they don't even know who's leading their equity work, which was really surprising to me when I started to hear it, and it's becoming more common of a theme. Or that person doesn't have enough authority. But two is they're going beyond sort of technical fixes. You can't just change your hiring policy or your HR policy or create a new program and you're going to be equitable. This is like deep-seated cultural stuff that has to do with what's valued in the institution. How do people know what's true? Are the outcomes rooted in a model of impact that is frankly rooted in white supremacy or management literature written by, about, and until recently for white men? And that's not even just structural work. That's like really hard interpersonal work. And I think the places that really recognize that and lead from there go a lot farther than places who think we're going to hire somebody, we'll bring on a consultant, they'll make recommendations, we'll adopt the policies, and then we'll kind of, be done.
Right.
And all of that leads back to emerging leaders, because this is the most progressive generation in documented history. It's the most diverse generation if we're talking just about millennials, but Gen Xers are right there too. And let's not sleep on Gen X because they're taking the reins real soon, including now, right? And so really progressive, really diverse, and they're making decisions about their future based on whether their employers are really serious about this stuff. And so if, 2 years ago, all the questions I got were about how to re-engage millennials. You can't do that without addressing these questions, and it's just not easy. And it really comes down to, is the traditional or the common currently way of doing things that is considered best practice really rooted in our values, or is it not?
That was a chock full answer. There's a lot of questions I have from that, but I want to start from the back, the values-based question. I think that is so important. And so can you answer that? Like, are our practices based on our values? Like, are we living up to the values around philanthropy and how we are engaging communities and working together to solve problems?
Well, I think there's some discourse going on in the field right now about what the underlying values of philanthropy should be. And I think that happens between sort of mainstream liberal, for lack of a better word, institutions who have values that run the gamut, and the sort of social justice wing or left flank of philanthropy, values are a little bit more radical. So we rewrote our values, and I'll just use us as an example because I think it helps to ground the conversation. So our values used to be multi-generationalism and impact and one more, and now they're shared leadership, community, excellence. We call it diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we really mean social justice and learning. And the key one in there for me is, in addition to social justice, which undergirds everything that we do, is actually shared leadership, right? And that really sort of opens the door for all those things we were talking about around different ways of knowing, different ways of showing up. And it's rooted in the idea, which is not our idea, we're part of a broader movement on this, that people who are most affected by inequity are in the best position to solve their own problems if they have the resources and power to do so, or can gain the resources and power to do so. But a lot of philanthropy is still rooted in this idea that we have solutions, we just need to scale them, but the solutions are too often about the individuals, as though if the individuals just, knew more or learned better or were better prepared for the economy, that systemic racism would go away. And we all know that that's not true. So I think that there's a reckoning where on a surface level, we have the same values, but we don't really fully understand the impact of how our practices play out with respect to those values.
So in your 2.5 years with the organization, how, if at all, has your definition of philanthropy changed, or your thinking about what philanthropy should be doing? Like, has it changed at all? It sounds like the mission of the organization has absolutely changed and sort of more tightly fits into like what the needs are of right now. And so I'm curious as to your personal thoughts about philanthropy. How have they changed, and what is your current definition of philanthropy?
So organizationally, our definition is kind of boring. I mean, we work mostly with foundations of different kinds because that's what we know, and that's what our offerings are best tailored to serve. But I do think, we love to talk about how philanthropy means love of humankind. I think one of the challenges with philanthropy is that people in it feel really disconnected from the work, especially folks who come from grassroots. And ultimately, Pope Francis talks about subsidiarity, the idea that social change happens at the smallest possible unit of society, or Adrienne Marie Brown calls that fractals. We have to transform ourselves to transform society. And I think both of those things are true, right? Institutional philanthropy has huge power in this country, can resolve municipal insolvency and save art at the same time, right? We can seed the modern 911 system or the green revolution. But in order to really be on the right side of history here, it requires all of us, I think, to take on what we can take on personally and professionally, but also to really examine ourselves in relationship to the impact that we have on other people, and to make the space for folks to be able to share the impact that our actions have on them. And I say this as a cisgender, straight, white guy, right? And my colleague and dear friend, Rai Young, says that he was once told, we all walk around with a yoke over our shoulders, and the more privilege we have, the wider the yoke is, and it's our job to make the yoke as small as possible and to turn really carefully when we make turns.
Thank you for that. Talk to me about what you are hearing from your members around their level of excitement and hope for careers in philanthropy. I've had some conversations just personally with, some people who were super excited to, join the field of philanthropy and, working at foundations and, other grant making organizations, and feeling, after being there for some time, feeling a bit deflated about their ability to really, create change, or making sure that, funding is funneled to the right people, or just really feel, I think one of the biggest things, or the most common things that I've heard, is feeling like they're able to have an impact and make a difference. You have access to many more people through your membership and sort of your work with foundations. What are you hearing? Like, what are the biggest issues or concerns that you're hearing from folks who are on the ground?
Well, I mean, first of all, what you're saying is so real. And I mean, you've basically captured the narrative perfectly. So the first thing I'll say, and not only have we had these conversations, but we have some research forthcoming that will put numbers to this. People are proud to work in philanthropy. We don't actually know whether that means they're proud of their institution or they're proud that they made it to the point that they're in a prestigious institution, which is something we'll probably look into a little bit more. But they all believe that philanthropy has this power. But we hear things like a really tiny percentage of people, particularly at the associate level in philanthropy, see a future for themselves in their institutions. Often they're told explicitly that there's nowhere for them to go if they want to move up within the institution, but that they don't get the support that they need in order to figure out what's next, or it's not systematized in the institution. And I think people would be surprised how deflating that is, because it leaves folks feeling like their value is questionable in a way that I don't think their supervisors and management actually believe. But folks just don't know what to do about it. It's often left to the individual supervisor. So that's one of the starkest findings. But then there's a lot that we've seen that shows that folks, again, don't feel comfortable bringing their full selves to work, or, they try to show up in a certain way and they feel shut down, or like what they're saying just isn't being heard. We had a member, after Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were killed, called and told me, I took a mental health day today because I couldn't stand the idea of walking into my institution and having to explain to people why I was upset. If our laws were different, that would almost be a hostile work environment, right? But that's not how our laws are designed. And the data shakes out in some interesting and unexpected ways. But, there are folks who feel like they have to hide parts of their identity, particularly folks who identify as LGBTQ, right? Other folks can't do that. Folks struggle to figure out how much they're willing to code switch, all those different things. And that leads people to burn out. So there are a lot of folks who, when we ask them in our survey, when they see themselves leaving philanthropy, and when they leave philanthropy, it will be because. And there are a lot of folks who said, I'm going to leave because I'm tired.
Right.
And I don't know if it's worse if they leave because they're tired, or if they don't leave and stay tired for them and for the field. But the thing I want to emphasize, when I talk about the research, I was talking to the head of a pretty respected think tank in philanthropy, and he said to me, your paper is awesome, but it's really depressing. And so I want to sound a note of optimism here, because all of these are solvable problems, right? And some of the solutions are technical, and some of them require us to change little things about how we think, and others require deeper self-examination. But to me, that is like what philanthropy is called upon to do in this moment, and we can't look away. And my fear for philanthropy is that, the folks who are fighting this fight now will get tired and will leave, and will be left with a sort of adverse selection problem of folks who are just going to play the game, right? And then status quo ante. That scares me. That was supposed to be optimistic, and I got depressing again.
It's all right. The truth is the truth. So what do you think the responsibility is of the institution right now? So let's say you had the floor, and there were, the most prestigious foundations in the room, and they wanted to know, like, we care about this issue. We want to make progress. We know there's a problem. We know that, emerging leaders really are important to the sustainability of our organizations and really creating the impact that we want. Tell us what to do. Like, what is, and I know you said, some of it is structural, some of it is self-examination, but like, what are there 3 or 5 takeaways that an organization could at least use as a primer? Because also in my conversations, as painful and quite frankly infuriating as it is for me when I'm having conversations with people, in leadership roles, there is sometimes this like real lack of understanding of the problem. And so that there definitely is a level of, privilege connected with that. And it's hard for someone like me to grapple and understand like how someone could be so disconnected, but it's the reality. So rather than sort of sitting with my, arms folded and annoyed and frustrated and huffing and puffing, like, okay, if we have to extend the branch to get to where we need to go, like how can we help to direct people to like those next steps or first steps?
Yeah. So first, if you don't mind, I do want to go back and say a couple of things that make me optimistic, because I have my days. I've been in this field now. I'm 34, but I've been in this field a dozen years, and I have days when I'm like, man, screw it. Like, I'm just going to go sit in a rocking chair, right? Or like, let me open like an artisanal donut shop. I don't know, whatever millennials are supposed to do. But the thing that gets me really re-energized and grounded is actually our members. They are amazing. And, when we made our strategic shift, like, we didn't just decide that this was going to be what it is. Like, we did decide that, but we couldn't have done it if our members weren't down. And, our process, we had as many as 200 people involved from start to finish. We had members literally editing our mission in a Google document. And there's a level of ownership there, and people have signed up. We have 16 chapters around the country. About 14 of them are active. And we have folks who basically sign on to be leaders for equity in philanthropy at the regional level. We're still growing into what that looks like. But as we have the conversations about how do we get from here to there, I learned so much from them. They're incredibly thoughtful. They're so passionate. They're already, doing this leadership in their organizations. They're already talking to executives locally and nationally. Like, they're players. And under 30, they're players. In some cases, under 25. Like, they're leading now. That gives me a ton of hope. And just their wisdom is really amazing. And, foundation CEOs, if you're listening to this, I would strongly encourage you to go check out an EPIP chapter event or reach out to chapter leadership, because these guys have a lot to offer. And the other thing that gives me hope, honestly, is how unapologetic the movements are. I was sitting in at the Neighborhood Funders Group a couple of weeks ago to a workshop run by the Movement for Black Lives. And they're just like, here's how we're going to win. We're going to train 50,000 people, and we're going to do this. And I'm like, they're doing it. We can be on the right side of it or not, but they're doing it. And that's really energizing to me. To get to your question, and thank you for bearing with my sort of roundabout way of getting there. The one thing I want to say is we don't have all the answers yet. Our process here is to say, and we may never, but our process is to say, first, let's just bring, philanthropy values rigor. And rightly or not, we want to bring some numbers to this just so folks can get a sense of the scope of the issue. And now, as we do that, we start hearing from people what they're trying to do and where they're getting stuck. And I think the next step for us is to dig in more deeply there. And I want to be clear, there are folks who are ahead of us in doing that specifically around racial equity and social justice.
Okay.
So folks like ABFI, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, Frontline Solutions. I mean, there's a bunch, and I'm only naming a small number of them. And they do this all the time. But what I think we don't get to is actually sort of where are people trying to do this and not doing it effectively, and what are like the common mistakes. I mentioned earlier not putting somebody clearly in charge or not giving that person enough authority, or like we hear stories about people who make racial equity working groups internally, but it's only junior people, or it's only senior people, or it's only people of color. I don't think I've heard of examples where there are no people of color, right? And that's like all of those things are deauthorizing in different ways. And so, there are things that you can do structurally that really do make a difference. So I don't want to dismiss structural solutions. And that's sort of one piece. One of the key things is that folks can, and this is a hypothesis that we're exploring now, can you actually reconfigure your organizational learning processes so that not just emerging leaders, but actually communities can participate at moments in the process where it actually makes a difference? And can you set them up in such a way that you're actually interrogating your core assumptions about the work? And I'll use scale as an example, right? I've used it before. I think there's room for scale in the changes that we make. The question is scaling what and for what reason, right? And, if we just rehab this many more housing units, we'd be in a better place. That's true, but it doesn't fix the housing market, right, and our policies. And when we're hearing from folks on the ground that that's actually not what they need, is it actually changing what we're doing, or are we wedded to the way we've done it because that's what we believe? And what's more important, right? And for me, I may be the executive director of EPIP, but I'm really the steward of a group of 1,400 leaders. And so, my job is to represent their collective consensus. And I think that foundations have more of a role like that than they realize. And if that sounds like it's pretty far afield from work around emerging leaders, it's all connected. And I think that's part of the core message that we're trying to drive. Then there's some actual technical stuff. I've been helping to maintain our job board recently, and I've seen some really over-designed jobs where you're putting too much in the job description, or folks are saying, they're going to schedule things and develop a grant recommendation. Oh, and you need a master's degree and 5 years of experience. And it's you are designing the job for somebody to be unhappy within 2 months. Or they say it's a great opportunity to move up, but the opportunity is not really there. And it's people's best intentions. They really want that to be true. But as an executive, as you know, right, we live in the vision, but our staff live in the reality.
Right.
And we fail to recognize that at our own peril. And unfortunately for our staff, at theirs. And so things like that, hiring people for jobs they don't really want because they want to get into philanthropy, those things don't really help us either. So those are a few examples of things that I've been thinking about. But our next step is going to be to, once we release this report, which will be happening this summer, really start briefing people and asking them, where are you getting stuck? And where can, your colleagues around the country sort of be helpful? And then we're going to follow that thread, and you can bet we'll be reporting back.
So without, I'm always about getting the scoop or sharing some information with our audience as early as possible. So without sort of giving up the goods in your report before you're ready to, is there any one surprising, shocking, totally didn't think that was going to come up in your report that did? So anything that you could share here?
Well, I've actually been sprinkling them throughout the interview. So they're in there. I just haven't tied them directly to that one report.
Got it.
So you've got the scoop.
You heard it here, people. We've got it first. So, Tamir, I want to talk a little bit about people of color, women of color, and LGBTQ as it relates to philanthropy. I know that oftentimes, for myself, I'm a African-American woman, and sometimes when I'm the only one in the room, there's feels like there's a greater responsibility for me to sort of, make it happen because I want to make sure that experience is, an option for someone else in the future. How, and so when we're talking about the things that you shared up until this point, sort of talks about, the emerging leaders, taking on a greater role, wanting to move things forward. But there's a sort of a burden with that. There's the burden of, sort of having to do the work. And so it reminds me of the idea of the oppressed, trying to show the oppressor, what to do. Yes. Has there been any conversations about that? I worry about people sort of taking on that level of burden and responsibility and not having any real power, from a psychological and emotional standpoint. Any sort of thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And, it reminds me of a story that somebody told me where she felt that whenever she was in a meeting and important decisions were going to be made, she would never go to the bathroom. Because if she left the room, those decisions would be made without any perspective from somebody of her background. And so I don't say that to explain to you perhaps your own experience, but just to represent how much that comes up in conversations with our membership and with other folks in the field. And I could not agree with you more that it is both ineffective and morally wrong for us to expect people for marginalized communities to sort of illuminate the path for the rest of us. And that's not to fault people who choose to do that. I have a world of respect for those folks. Many of them are my close friends. But I think as white folks, and speaking for myself, right, have to be really aware of the toll that it takes on people. I should also say I'm very fortunate to have had colleagues of color in my past professionally who have helped to show me the way when the way that I thought I was being supportive was actually hurtful. And, I'm really grateful for that. And now that that's been done for me, I feel the responsibility to do that with other white folks. So for us programmatically, what that means is, our first sort of revamped program was something called the People of Color Network. It had been a pilot in the past. We tried it a couple of different ways. We made a POC exclusive, and the idea there is like, come to this place where you don't have to explain yourself, frankly, to people who may not understand. Not that that doesn't also happen between communities of color, but at least, don't have to educate white folks in this space. But the next thing that we're going to be working on after our conference next month is called Inclusive Leadership Programming. And that's predicated on the idea that solidarity is everyone's work, right? But particularly for our white members, making sure that folks really understand, how racial inequity shows up in the workplace, what they can do as folks who carry more power and privilege, and how they can show up in settings so that all EPIP spaces are anti-racist and anti-oppressive spaces. But also, I talk about 45% of our members being people of color. There's the other 55%, right? And that's even still a fraction of the folks who are in philanthropy. And my feeling is that if we are successful and our colleagues are successful in really sort of preparing folks to do this work now, that we can see a real sea change in philanthropy moving forward.
What would you say to someone, Tamir, who you talked about people who didn't see themselves in the field, in the next 2 years or whatever time frame. What would you say to someone who is at that point, is like, I'm out? Like, because you expressed a couple of points of optimism. And so if someone is, has one foot out the door and doesn't really want to leave, but they're just frustrated, what advice would you share?
My first thing is do what you got to do. I don't think it's anybody's. I don't think it's anybody's responsibility to stay here and fight, because you can fight from anywhere. You can fight from corporate America. You can fight from electoral politics. You can be a movement. And I know people have different feelings about this, but if you want to go be an expat somewhere and just live your life, do what you need to do. So, but what I try to do with people in those situations, and it happens a lot, is just sort of hear out where they're feeling stuck and what resources are available to them. Because my part of my job is to help keep people in the field, but not in a coercive way, right? Mm-hmm. So what I try to do is help understand where people are feeling stuck, what strategies are available to them to address the issues that are causing them to struggle. A lot of folks actually need to leave the field, and they don't for different reasons, whether it's access to power, whether it's opportunity. Pay scale is an issue. We're not candid enough about that in philanthropy, and leaving philanthropy often come with sort of adverse financial implications that not everybody can afford to sustain. So all that stuff, sort of, putting it on the table and then letting people make a sort of informed calculus about what they're willing to go to bat for, what the risks are to them, how can they mitigate those risks, and then, what's ultimately worth it. And I will say a lot of folks end up staying. And I'm not trying to attribute it just to me. I think this is what we do sort of organizationally, right? And, sort of finding peers who can sort of help them strategize around this.
Has the political climate had any impact on membership or the number of people you see going into philanthropy? I'm just curious.
Going into philanthropy, I'm not sure. I think the thing that the political climate has really done is it's made the battle lines of equity really, really clear. Right, like when President Obama was being called the deporter in chief, philanthropy was not having conversations about immigration the way that it is now.
Right.
But when some of the driving rhetoric behind that changed, the head of the United Philanthropy Forum just yesterday released a statement saying, "Stop separating families now," which is one of the most explicit statements I've ever heard. Coming out of a philanthropic institution or a philanthropy serving organization. Full disclosure, I'm on the board, but still, it's a powerful statement. And so I think that's changed things. I think people feel a greater sense of urgency around making things work because they don't want to be on the sidelines, or frankly, they don't want to be living relatively comfortably when people are suffering, and to know that they could have done more, but they were afraid to take a certain kind of risk or to speak out. So I don't think it's brought more people into the field. I think it's made people really want to be connected to movement in a way that was not as galvanizing 3 years ago.
Gotcha. I think this is going to be my last question. And of course, you can add anything you'd like. Based on all that you've done in the last 2.5 years, and all of the energy behind the members and sort of building up this movement, what are your sort of 3 to 5 year goals? Or if you're looking back at that time, whether 2020, where are we, 25 or 23, what would you like to see, as far as progress with your movement and what EPIP is creating?
Mm-hmm. So big picture in 5 years, and this is not something EPIP's going to do by itself. I want to see movement wielding real power in the halls of philanthropy, right? That there's actual accountability to movements, which doesn't necessarily mean that foundations stop funding everything they're funding and only fund movement, but that there's at least honesty around, what the paradigms are, what's being funded and why, and, ultimately, how is community actually conveying that there is impact because of that? Right. And that we are jettisoning this idea that communities and everyday people can't be the architects of their own lives because they don't understand all the things we went to school to learn. I find that incredibly insulting, and I always have. So that said, for EPIP, for us, success would look like, our members are exerting real influence, basically in service of that message. Right. And, engaging with foundation CEOs, becoming foundation CEOs, or, moving into other capacities that enable them to really affect the flow in terms of dollars so that folks are better able to do this work with less inappropriate interference from philanthropy.
Is there anything else you would like to add or share with our listeners?
Well, one, I want to thank you again. And two, I just want to say again, if you're in a city with an EPIP chapter and you want to get in touch with them, get in touch with me. Because again, these guys, they are going to change the face of philanthropy, and in many respects, they literally already are. And so, let's get connected, let's get into dialogue and really start working through some of these challenges at a field level.
Any events coming up, Tamir, that folks should be aware of?
As a matter of fact, our national conference is taking place in Detroit, July 30th through August 1st. It's called The Road Ahead, Leadership in Uncertain Times. And the theme is literally everything we've just talked about. So how can folks reimagine their leadership and how they sort of carry out that leadership in the times we live in? And it's organized around 3 themes: collaborative visioning, collaborative leadership, and collaborative action. So while we support the individual, it's really all about what we do together and how we harness our collective power. So I hope to see everybody there.
And where can they go to get more information about the conference or EPIP in general?
www.epip.org.
Perfect. Tamir, this was an absolute pleasure. I thank you for your time, and definitely will have you back on to check in a couple of months.
I'd love that. Thank you for inviting me.
One of the things I'm noticing in each of these interviews around philanthropy is just the commonality of the themes that people are sharing. The importance of inclusion for marginalized groups, and really the need for us to take a close look at philanthropic institutions and the environment that they're creating for people to have impact and to sort of share their insights and expertise in a way that can really help us to create change. I'm really appreciative of Tamir's insights and thoughts. And one of the things that he said that was really interesting to me was this concept of shared leadership, thinking about how we can ensure that everyone has an opportunity to lead, to have input, and to contribute, to make sure that the organizations that are doing the work are able to really have outcomes that are beneficial to the groups that they serve. And so I hope you enjoyed this interview. As I shared, this is we're winding down the season, and our final episode is next week. Enjoy.